All right, hi everyone. We're gonna transfer over and we're gonna get started. Let me just adjust some audio things. But first of all, I'm gonna say welcome on everyone. This is gonna be episode 3 of Myst Minutes. I'm super excited to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Whitson, who is a game studies scholar at the University of Waterloo. But I'm gonna let her introduce herself by herself in just a second. But first of all, I'm gonna do a little intro stuff that I like to do. So hi everyone, welcome to Myst Minutes. This is a podcast about celebrating the projects and the passions of content creators, about game developers, and about games researchers. I'm Sierra Myst. I am your queer drag queen streamer. You can find me everywhere at twitch.tv/SierraXMyst and basically everywhere else with the same username. And I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Whitson, who I will let introduce herself right now.
Hi, Sierra. Thanks for having me. I'm Dr. Jen Whitson. I have a PhD in games, I suppose. I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada, Ontario, Canada.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of, how do you get a PhD in games? Like, what does that mean?
I mean, you fall into it ass backwards for most people. And I guess I'll tell the prototypical sort of way that people fall into it, and then the way that I fell into it personally. But like, let's be honest, like most people who end up studying games for academic careers, they're just people who love to play games and they think about them and talk about them. But they decided they actually wanted to do that as a career, but they didn't want to make games. And so they were usually in fields. It started like game studies as a field started, around 2000, and a whole bunch of people in English and film and those sort of media studies realized, why weren't we looking at video games with the same sort of serious attention that we're looking at novels or at cinema or art? So that's how a lot of people started. And they sort of went broader from there. They look at video games as texts or books. They look at players. They look at how games impact and shape our culture. Or people like me look at how games are made and who makes them and why they're made in the ways that they are.
Yeah.
The way that I fell in ass backwards is I actually have a degree in criminology, and I did a master's degree on technocrime, looking at identity theft and things like that. And I was interested in the question about how do you get people to behave online when you can't throw them in jail, right? You don't have actual people attached to names. And so then I started talking to video game developers who were making an MMO for tween girls, right? Because they had all of these problems that they were trying to hack or solve. How do you stop it from turning into mean girls?
Right.
How do you stop the creepy uncles from coming into your space and like lurking? And so you can't go to your local cop. Like they don't know what the fuck you're talking about, and they don't know how to help. And your creepy uncle could be like in Albania or somewhere. So you kind of have to rely on game developers and creators for your online spaces to build those spaces in a way that get people to channel their behavior in certain directions.
Yeah.
And so by talking to developers about that, and by the way, like the ways that they solve these problems, if you want to hear about them, are like completely bonkers to me. But in talking to these game developers to think about like these, I guess, criminological questions, I'm like, man, I just really like game developers as people, right? Like I am a geek just like them. We read all the same science fiction novels. We care about some of the same things. And a lot of like the same things that they're stressing about or wondering about or worrying about are the same things like I'm worrying about. Like, why don't I research them? And so that's sort of how I fell into it.
Yeah. And so like why should kind of like regular like Twitch viewers or like regular people who play games like care about game studies, right? And like I think you could ask this about like a lot of different like disciplines or areas of study. Why should the average player care about like game studies?
I guess if you're like me and want to know more about game developers and how games and play shape our behavior and who we are as human beings, both for good or for bad. Especially if we spend so much time playing games in our lives, then game studies is where you go, or it's important to sort of dip your toes in. If you like the meta, then game studies is definitely where you go. Blogs are great, but sometimes it's really nice to dig a bit deeper, right? Like get info that's based on years of somebody researching topics, running studies, rather than from somebody who's like partly influenced by, you know, I got to crank out this blog post this afternoon and I got to attract readers. And they certainly don't have years to dedicate to answering one question. But like maybe regular gamers or Twitch viewers might be interested in game studies because they're wondering why everybody's an asshole online, and especially in games. You know, and what's being done about it. Or you want to know whether you should believe all those moral panics that, you know, your aunties or, you know, grandparents are saying that games are addictive or making kids violent or whatever. Then game studies is the place that you should go to sort that shit out, right? There are empirical research studies that show the positive effects of games on learning. They break apart some of the moral panics, but they also show you some of the negatives, right? They show you how and why games and interfaces like Twitch are designed to keep you watching and take your money, right? And you know, like give your money to Sierra. You know, how are these things designed this way? And it's just like, if you're curious, game studies is a great place to dip in because you can learn about something that you love in a totally different way. But yeah, basically, if you just like games or streaming, and you want to know more and want to have some sort of filter, which is academic peer review, to sort of weed out a lot of the personal opinion or the corporate shillery or the bullshit, and you like being sort of critical, because academics like myself, we don't make money from what we publish, it's a good place to start. And I'd always suggest you go to a site like firstpersonscholar.com or Critical Distance, because they sort of sit at a midway between sort of like an academic journal and just a lot of our other sort of sites where we go to get gaming and sort of streaming information. And so that's where you dip your gateway drug into academic game studies.
And then, so kind of, where does your own research come into that? Like, where do you go from technocrime into game studies?
I think so. I go a lot of places, and this is the brilliant thing about being an academic researcher, is nobody tells you what to do, so you can kind of just follow what you were interested in at the time. So I guess I'll like flip back to my story about, you know, how did these sort of MMO makers solve these problems, and sort of tell my personal narrative. Is that, you know, how do you keep the sort of tween girls from going all mean girls, or how do you keep the sort of creepy uncles out? Well, basically, you just give that job to a co-op who you know has that problem to solve. And so they started like creating all these ban lists and things like this, you know, then it just becomes for the mean girl effect, and then it becomes this one-up race, right? The girls are trying to like outthink and find up new and novel slurs, and you know, the co-op is going back and forth. So those are like those sorts of solutions. The creepy uncles is like, you can't like ask somebody for proof of identity or age to go into your MMO, because like that would flag all sorts of red flags. And so they're like, well, you know, the problem isn't the creepy uncles, it's actually like the creepy uncles luring these like tween girls to somewhere like physical. And so if you can't actually give them numbers for an address or a phone number, then we're all safe. Everything is all good. So we're just gonna ban all numbers. And maybe all words, because like people don't want to talk or communicate in like online spaces at all. And so like that was that sort of interesting moment, like this aha moment for me, being like, you know, some of what these developers do, which are just sort of like, it was just like a poor co-op, right? Like it's this random hack solution that works. But if that MMO takes off, or, you know, inspires other places, those solutions sort of, they become built into the foundation of our digital space. And once you get them rolling, it's really hard to stop and change direction. And so that's what I wanted to figure out more. But like figure out like, guess what? You know, it's not like you can go and hang out with game developers all you want and like learn about these things. And actually, if you do hang out with game developers, like sitting and watching them code is like paint dry, right? You actually, the better thing to do is like sit out and like after hours and drink beers with them and like talk about that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So what I sort of started doing was like lurking, like any good person does, is you lurk on, you know, there were sort of blogs and forums and conferences and sort of figuring out, I was trying to figure out a way to get in so I could have more context to hear more of these like crazy stories about like governance and like controlling people. But game developers actually don't want to control people all that much. They're just trying to get by.
Right.
And so then at that time, gamification was the big thing, right? And Facebook games and free-to-play games. And that's sort of how I fell into a lot of my research, was thinking about the console development and why it was so extremely shitty for the developers that I had known and hung out with and drank beers with. You know, they were working 70-hour weeks, you know, for 3 years on the same video game, like coding the same arm movements for one character.
Right.
And it was just a really like, for what looks like creative work, it was really uncreative work that, you know, can be sort of soul numbing, right? Crunch is real for them. And so at that time when gamification and free-to-play games and all of that sort of stuff was hitting, it seemed like there was all of these new opportunities to be creative and make changes in the world and make different sorts of games.
Right.
And so developers were leaving sort of console development and looking to find greener pastures. And so I'm like, well, why don't I actually follow them and see what they find when they get there? And like, surprise, surprise, you know, they just changed one shitty set of overlords for another shitty set of overlords.
Okay.
Like, because figure that is once you sort of start developing for a platform like, or games for a platform like Apple or Facebook, it's free to play. So you have to start designing to get people to pick up your game and play, to spend more and more time in your game and play, and to sort of convert them into playing players. And so that's sort of the way that you do that, is by collecting data about them and watching what your players are doing and tweaking bits of your games, like changing the store button from pink to red and measuring to see which one will get people to, you know, click that button to pay more. And so instead of having this creative, you know, greener pastures, because you were constrained in console, you found that you were constrained in an entirely different way by all of these sort of metrics that were watching what players were doing and telling you how you should like optimize your game to get more players and keep them in. And so that data-driven design and what that means for both the games that we play, but also creative work and creative labor, and how that's exported out more broadly to all of our work, even if we aren't game developers or content creators or creators more generally, I think is like a really big and phenomenal shift. So I've sort of been following that wave and some of those trends more broadly.
Yeah, and so like I think we can all remember like the time when like Farmville and like these sorts of games, that was like the moment, right? And you know, games were accessible to everyone, they were free, it was on Facebook, grandma was playing Farmville, all that kind of stuff. And so that was back then. I guess, what does that look like now? Like, what is the thing, at least in your research and when I think about this surveillance, that's interesting, you know, almost a decade after the Farmville explosion?
You know what? And this is like, it's a big, in some sense, it's a big sort of question mark, because people don't want to say what it looks like, because it can be increasingly creepy, right? Even sort of 10 years ago in Farmville sort of games, like the developers of Farmville, Zynga, were sort of going to developer conferences and talking about what they were doing, right?
Yeah.
This A/B testing that came out of web advertising. But they're like, you know what? We just don't want to do that. We want to, know about each and every player. We want to build what's called psychographical profiles, right? By looking at their contact lists, their chats, their sort of personality of play habits, so that we know exactly what sort of triggers we can send them in game. Like, are they competitive? Like, maybe we can have the NPC sort of give them a little nudge. Are they like socially motivated? Maybe we need to do something else, right? Like send them some sort of message about what their friends are doing in game. And so like we can send them individually tailored messages to sort of compel them to move in a certain direction that we want them to, right?
Yeah.
So it's about learning about your players, predicting and then manipulating. And that was, almost 10 years ago now. So honestly, I'm not sure what they're doing now, but what they were doing in because I'm no longer sort of hanging out in those same circles in the same way. But what they were doing in sort of, Facebook and free to play games, it was so successful that it was exported out much more broadly, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just like blame those evil casuals, right? That's not what I'm saying. It was just this. It was just the tip of the iceberg, and it was a trend that is everywhere now.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so I guess like what parts of your research maybe is interesting to you about Twitch itself, or about like live streaming, or about what gaming maybe looks like now?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, what's interesting to me now, especially when you bring in Twitch and streaming, is that video gaming and play, even before like video games, has always been social, right? There was only this really small point in time where games were asocial things that you played in your basement on a console that was not connected to other human beings, or even sort of couch co-op games. But sort of streaming has brought this new level of sociality to it, this whole sort of appreciation of skill and spectatorship and the joys of watching other people play, which I think is really interesting and joyful. It's also shifted the register, right? Because not only in terms of what it means to be creative in the industry, it's not people just making video games, it's content creators remixing or streaming, or people like you who have whole careers sort of talking about games in general.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. But like honestly, like I'm a cynic, right? I'm a joyful cynic. I like to think about how people are manipulated, and so like, and I like thinking about the back end, right? The manipulations, right? How is sort of Twitch designed to get content creators to make certain stuff? How is it designed to get your community to spend more time on Twitch, to spend more money? How are design choices in platforms more generally, right? From reputation systems to chat systems to content filters to recommendation systems. How do they tell us what to love? How do they shape who we are, right? Who we be and how we interact with them, and how we talk. And like this is all done by corporate overlords, right? Who don't give a shit about us as people or as individual humans, but as something that can generate data that then can be used to predict and manipulate us, right? And manipulate both content creators and viewers. And so those sorts of things are like pulling behind the curtains, like I love it, right? It's really juicy, seeing how the sausage is made. And like, sometimes it's all smoke and mirrors, right? You're like, oh, well, they can have all this data about players, and Zynga is saying that they can, send these individual messages. And then you find out, oh, maybe it was all just marketing bullshit. And they actually are just manipulating people because they want to get investors to buy in or stuff like that. But most of the time, it's like really, really interesting things. And like once you know how that system works, you can be that virus in the system, or you can manipulate the system, or you can game the system, or you can think about how you can build or design better systems, better platforms, to sort of keep you and what's happening here, like in these great creative spaces, all the good stuff, but like sort of toss out all the rest of the shit that we don't want.
Yeah. But like, what does that look like though, right? Like, how do you toss out the stuff that keeps it running at the end of the day?
I think you follow the money, right? I mean, in any sort of platform, it like Twitch, like Facebook, like Google, if it is free to use, or if the majority of users aren't paying to use it, then you are the product, right? If you don't need to pay to watch or pay to play, it's you that's going to be your data that you generate is somehow going to be collected and repackaged and sold or used in some way to make the developers sort of profit.
Yeah.
So the way of thinking through that is to be like, okay, well, do we want to sort of support different ways where, like, if we're viewing, we pay, or do we want to introduce regulations at a government level, you know, like GDPR, that limit how much and what sort of corporations can do, right? And like, maybe you're okay with Twitch collecting your data and doing it here, but Twitch is also sharing your data with a whole bunch of third parties that you didn't give consent to. So maybe we just need to sort of tweak those sort of things so that Twitch can only use your data in a way that you're actually like, yes, I agree to this specific thing. No, you can't share it with all of your sort of like Silicon Valley buddies, right?
Yeah.
So the legal regulations is sort of another sort of way that you could do it. But like, I mean, this is sort of tech and sort of games and culture are all like this melting point of innovation, right? And people can find new ideas, right? Just because we're using these sorts of platforms now, it doesn't mean that somebody can't introduce something even better, you know, in the future. Like, man, like think like 10 years ago, we didn't have the smartphones that we have today, right? We didn't have the social media that we have today. And so like, we're so immersed into the platforms that we have that we can't think of a life without them, but they've only been around for such a short time that we just have to like think otherwise.
Yeah. And then I guess kind of like, I guess what's interesting to me about that is this idea of like, where do like the content creators like fit into this as well, right? Because it's the content creators who do profit off of this, right? That profit off of this like platform. But obviously they are just trying to survive as well. So how do you balance these kinds of things when you're trying to like follow the money, right?
I think it's really easy, and like I'm guilty of doing this right now as I'm talking to you, to blame like, oh, those dirty corporates or those dirty, you know, content creators who are just like streaming these games and giving away the story, and so now people aren't gonna buy them from the developers because they've already seen how they ended. And I think for me as an academic researcher, the way that I stop myself or do a double take is to actually talk to all of those people, because once you actually talk to them and interview them or watch them work or hang out with them, you discover that things aren't that black and white, right? And you know, even the developers who are using these sort of data collection systems to learn about you as players or viewers, they don't want to do that. Like, they just want to make cool games and pay their rent, right? But it's sort of these larger pressures and systems that are structured to pressure them to do that in a certain way. And so I think that once you understand their context and these other problems that they're trying to solve, then it becomes a lot easier to, it makes it a lot more messier, but it becomes a lot more easier to think about what solutions might actually work, other than just like trying to pass the blame on somebody else. And I think when you look at the sort of question about content creators, they're sort of, I mean, it's this weird spot, because the whole sort of thing about platforms and celebrity and influencers nowadays, I sound like such an old person when I say a term like that. But is these stories of these like success, right? Rags to riches, right? You can start from nothing, build your own community, and you can be the next, I don't know, ninja or whatever, right? And you can do it. And like platforms have this vested interest in promoting these like these narratives of like, look, you can have millions in sponsorships and things like that. And they're doing that because they want to have all of these content creators or aspiring content creators to come and make free content for their channels, right? And we know like it's the same sort of thing. Like I think it's the analogy of the 21st century sort of equivalent to I want to grow up and become a rock star, or I want to grow up and become, you know, a Hollywood actress, or I want to grow up and become a hockey player, right? The likelihood of any of those things of actually making a living doing what you love as a content creator, or even as an indie game developer is very, very low. But we just haven't actually gathered the data or had enough academic research to show that, so that people are being like a little bit more suspicious or just do it with like the right mindset. So I think that those sort of narratives are used by platforms to get more content creators to create more content for their specific platform, celebrated by the platform as like advertising. And then if those content creators are creating that content for the platform, then the audience, the viewers, the community will follow too. And so content creators are sort of caught in the middle, right? Because like a lot of content creative work is like, how do I engage my audience? How do I give people something that they love? How do I build community? How do I build joy? How do I keep their eyes on me? How do I get them to throw money at the screen, right? But they too are also being shaped and manipulated, not only by like, you know, the demands of their audience, which they see in these metrics about like, oh, how many people were watching last night, or who's logging off, but the demands of the platform on the other side about what sorts of things that platform as sort of a company will reward or promote, but also the types of things that the interface itself, like the technical, physical coded interface and the affordances there, allow that content creator to do. So I think that these are really complex and important and interesting problems. And so we need people to be in the inside to understand how complex they are from a research perspective, to think about what are some tweaks we can make or better ways of doing this to fix it, so that we can, you know, make it a little bit more equitable or a little bit less exploitative. And I think academic research is really important because you can't do that from the inside as an employee or a content creator or an audience or a community member, because you're too invested. You're right. You're too much into it that you can't step out and move to the different like levels in the same way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so then how does someone like become like, we touched on it like a little bit, but like how does someone like move into this? So let's say like I am doing a bachelor's degree at some university somewhere in something, computer science, psychology, sociology, art, you know, where do I go to kind of dip my toe into becoming equipped to have these conversations, and to be that, to potentially go down a path of to be that person?
To be the virus in the system. So the first place you sort of do, like, again, first person scholar, critical distance are good ways to sort of, good sort of ways to dip your toes in. And I wish I had the list now, but there are lots of lists online about game studies and universities that sort of have programs. At the University of Waterloo, we have a Games Institute. It's called the Games Institute. And there's like, my part of game studies and the things that I'm interested in are very, very narrow, but the folk at the Games Institute do everything from like looking at VR sickness and you know, like, to studying games as text, to looking about how games can shape health behavior and things like that. So a lot of university programs have these sort of game studies elements, or sort of institutes or even individual classes. So that's a nice way to go.
Mhm.
If you want to go deeper, there is sort of there's an international research association that's open to folk who are just interested, and it's called DIGRA, DIGRA, the Digital Games Research Association, and they're online, and they have a conference every year. But you can go and sort of troll and look at their conference proceedings, which are sort of like short, I
Yeah.
don't know, 4-page papers,
Yeah.
and sort of like flip through and see like, oh man, this topic really interests me, and like I dig what this person is doing, or what they're writing. And that's sort of another way to figure out what sorts of areas interest you,
Mhm.
because like game studies is this weird sort of beast where it's a bit Frankenstein-ish, and we're really dislocated. It's not one discrete field where you enter a game studies program.
Yeah.
It's more like I guess an object or an area of study that encompasses everything from sort of, computer science to, English, to sociology, to psychology, to political science, to philosophy. And so once you sort of figure out what threads or what rabbit holes you want to fall down into, if
Yeah.
there are certain people, just drop them an email. And it sounds like really weird, but like academics are lonely people. We write like all of these papers, and we spend all of our time like hunched over researching, and then we throw our papers out into these sort of academic journals or conferences, and we don't know if anybody ever reads them at all. It's not like we get like fanboy like emails gushing over like our ideas. So yeah, I think that is a really good first step of doing it. But reaching out, like we're all human, we all love games and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then like people can point you in the right direction, but just like, I don't know, chat with people, network.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I kind of like, what are your current projects that you're working on then? What are you hunched over?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think like it's funny because like things that you wrote like 10 years ago are still like popping up and stuff like that. So like if you sort of Google my name, and part of that is my fault because I don't update my profiles or anything because I don't know, I'm terrible. I would never survive as a content creator. So 5-10 years ago, I was really into sort of things like gamification, right? And how like the Fitbit is sort of shaping our behavior and telling us what to value as feedback machines. And so I'm interested more generally in the ethics of what's called persuasive design and what are called dark patterns, which are sort of design techniques for designing interfaces or sort of objects that get people to do things like compulsive play. And so, one project that I had that was about like looking at like Pokemon Go and daily fantasy sports and comparing them to gambling and sort of those sort of linkages there. And the design of gambling and slot machines and that sort of history is also super interesting. That's a good rabbit hole to fall into.
Yeah, definitely.
That's one sort of area, but like honestly, I am like this.
Oop. Oop. We're gonna wait. Oh.
Oh, I am using. Uh-oh.
Okay, I think you're. Oh no. There's gonna be a shuffling.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Am I back?
I can hear you. Can you hear me in real time?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Am I back now?
Yes, you're back now. Perfect.
Sorry, I just switched to a different internet connection.
That's okay.
I'm so sorry.
Don't worry about it.
And so these dark patterns oh yeah, so now I lost my place, sorry. So personal interest right now. And so like, I think that developers are a canary in the coal mine for just the future of everybody's work more generally, right? This idea, especially independent game developers, right, where you make something in your house, you throw it up online on Apple or whatever, you start gathering data, you see if you get enough players, and you sort of try and make a career out of the content you create and building this community and sort of doing it on your own. So this really precarious gig work, I think that, and the struggle to get paid doing what you love, right? Because everybody is now told that we should get paid to do what we love.
Yeah.
And I'm obviously suspicious of that. So I think that is really interesting to me, because it leads to all of these actually terrible sort of things about like working ridiculously long hours, always being on the hustle of like having to self-promote and sell yourself and your game, of always having to pander to sort of like try and get money from funders and stuff like that, which I think shapes the types of games and products that we make. Having to survive or get paid or find a way to make income when nobody pays for anything anymore, content. I think that is interesting to me, especially because it drives us to do things that lead to, exploitation, right? Like this gathering data about people so you can manipulate them behind the scenes. So I think that's interesting to me. The pressures to measure and quantify the shit out of everything. That I think it is, it started, or it was really apparent to me when it started in games, and then it seems to have exploded everywhere. So I think that those sort of like really kind of boring working labor questions are interesting interesting to me, and like all of these questions about gender and representation. And who gets ahead in certain industries and certain careers, and who gets shit on all the time, whose work gets the six-figure salaries, right? And who gets the promotions, and which workers don't, right? And we know that the prototypical sort of engineers and sort of the coders, the developers, those type of people, they get the big salaries, whereas the artists, they get paid shit, right? But when you're playing a game, you can love a game just as much for its beautiful art style as you do for the smooth sort of game feel. But the ways that people are paid are a lot to do with sort of their status and their gender, or and like you add like cultural group and race and things like that on top of that, it becomes much more messy. So like I think that games are this really great place to study these larger questions about equity and fairness. Because it's so like, I don't have to say, like, it's so apparent in games that you don't have to like explain it to anybody. They're like, oh yeah, Gamergate.
It's so interesting. I think like what you're really pointing out here is that like it's not just about I like to play games, and so I'm going to study the game. Here's my journal article about Dragon Age. There is something big here to say and to look at games, and it's valuable, right?
Right. Like, and there are like, I fucking hate those type of papers that like, here's my paper about Dragon Age, but it is a valid field, and if that's what you love, go do it. Like there are people who have careers doing that, but like, why can't you make games your way of changing the actual world in like a strategic way, right? If they're like, don't use games and writing papers about Dragon Age as a way to escape the world which you think is shitty outside. Use games as sort of your entry point, as a way to understand that world and change that world that's shitty outside into something that's a little bit less shitty, right?
Yeah, because it's something that's become increasingly important for so many people, especially for generations that have come and like keep coming, and especially when we see how it interfaces with content creation, with all of these different platforms that are, people getting bottle fed off your cell phone or whatever from an early age, like that kind of thing. These kinds of questions, I think, are going to become more important.
Yeah, and like, again, like my personality is I like to shit on things a little bit, but like I ignore all of the game studies research, which is about how do we design things to give people pleasure. How do we design things to help people communicate better? How do we design in sort of a gameful, playful manner and export that to non-game context? So like when we're in a Zoom meeting, at a conference at work, that it actually feels like we're just as close to somebody that we're actually, playing a video game with. And so like, I think that is illustrative, like understanding how that occurs and happens in games is so important and has been so important in this past year when everybody is most everybody is stuck in an apartment and the only way that we can connect to each other is online. And so figuring out how and where that happens in games and how we can do that better more broadly and in other places, I think is like a really important place to be inspired by, and like we need more people doing that kind of work.
Yeah, and I think this year we've seen, we have the numbers on Twitch and how much of an influx there's been to Twitch, but also I think we all know at least one person who picked up a game for the first time, who picked up content creation because they lost their job, and if you're lucky to be in a country that's providing relief, or maybe you weren't, and so this seemed like a desperate only option. And so I think especially in like times like these, we can learn a lot more potentially maybe from games themselves. How are people struggling? How are people coping? How do people learn to get socialized online, right? How does that happen?
Yeah.
That's a rhetorical question. Unless you have an answer.
Like, I'm a sociologist, right? Like, that was what my PhD was in. So I probably I could, and but I mean, that's why we need, and actually I would say that there are not enough like proud sociologists who are studying these questions because they're important and we don't know enough about it. So there's lots of room. Come on in.
How do we get people prepared for the next pandemic, right?
Right. And it like I'm sorry to say that this is our new reality moving forward. So how do we make it like a cozy reality, right? And so far so much of the greatest stuff I think related to games that I read is done by developers like Tanya Short, who of Kitfox, who you talked to previously, right? Like they're getting together and they write these white papers about like how to make cozy games, like what sorts of things make games feel this way and create these relationships with people. And they wrote other groups like this wrote other papers about like, well, how do we work as ethical game designers? And so I think that there are all of these spaces in both the game industry as game professionals, but as academics, but as also just people who are interested to make these contributions that aren't just about playing games or writing Dragon Age papers, but about like, all of these spaces in between that are just as important, if not more.
Absolutely. I guess kind of like, what's your final takeaway? If there's someone that's like listening to this, where do they dive in? Why should they dive in? How? Maybe it's words of warning, perhaps, that you have instead.
I think that the words of warning is like, always be suspicious of people who say do what you love, because I mean, sure, I may make it sound like this is this glorious dream job, but just like anything else, the do what you love is like 10-20% of doing stuff you love or stuff that seems cool, and like 80% like administrative bullshit, right? Or stuff that isn't good. And I mean, so there's the first thing, is be suspicious of the do what you love. The second sort of thing is that it is hard work. You're going to cry. It's going to take a long time, right? Like it's not an easy route of just playing a lot of video games and ta-da, there's my PhD. And, and at the end of the PhD, like lots of people have PhD. There are very few jobs, at least in academia, for that, for profs like me. And so I think that, having an intellectual mindset and doing that research and doing your PhD is one thing, but I think you have to strategize and think about like, okay, there aren't a lot of jobs in academia, and maybe academia isn't a great place, especially if I want to change the larger world around me. So when I'm doing my PhD, I have to strategize about like, okay, what sort of industries do I want to go work in? And how do I translate like these ivory tower like papers that nobody reads into something that actual people in the industry or community actually know how to understand and know how I fit into their organization.
Yeah.
I think that is sort of another important thing. And I think like the last important thing is, I mean, sometimes you got to pick up the skills that nobody else wants to do, right? I mean, research methods is like sometimes boring as shit, right? Like reading over like long interviews and transcribing and trying to code and trying to make sense of it and spending years on a single small problem, right? Like it is really boring as shit. Statistics, like lots of people really, really hate it. But if you have those skills that are these like rare sorts of things that are really, really practical and usable that you developed in your academic career from one place or another. And it doesn't matter what discipline. That sets you apart from all of these other people who didn't do that hard work or go through and get those like boring as shit fundamentals. And they may not be boring as shit to you, right? Like I'm kind of being a jerk here, but like having those sorts of skills makes you different from all of these people who just, you know, play video games and know a lot about the industry and the field and stuff like that, but they just don't have those really practical tools, right?
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was like an excellent conversation. The chat is really vibing and having a great time. And so do you want to outro yourself? Do you want to remind everyone of who you are? And if you have, I don't know, do you have work that you want to plug? Is there something,
no,
that the Twitch...
I haven't updated my like website, like seriously, probably since I got my job, which is like 5 years ago. So. Well, you can like, I mean, Sierra has my Twitter. I'm at Jen Whitson on Twitter, www.jenniferwhitson.com, but that's like 5 years out of date. I would really sort of promote First Person Scholar, Critical Distance, Digra. Those sorts of places are great ways to sort of get your feet wet. And people are really friendly. Like, shoot us poor academics, we're lonely. Shoot us an email. Just say hey. And like, I mean, also hang out with your local game developers, right? I mean, you may be interested in watching Twitch and streamers and things like that, but there are sort of meetups where, you know, aspiring game makers are sort of getting together every month. Well, not lately,
right now,
but they're getting together every month to show the things that they're working on. And like, I think that it's great to watch the inside. You can see how the sausage is made from an entirely different direction. And some of those places are now sort of moving online slowly. And so I think that that's a really great meta is like, go watch how your sausage is made. Go talk to those game developers, because like they'll tell you some really great juicy things, and it gives you so much more pleasure, right? Playing a game where you're like, hey, I know the person who made this, or I saw them speak in you know, my city or on Twitch. So yeah, go watch those folks.
Absolutely. All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer Whitson. I really enjoyed this chat. And thank you everyone who listened. Next week we are going to have narrative designer Cheratomo on for Myst Minutes. So until then, I will catch you all then, and thank you all so much. Bye everyone.
Thanks all.
I will be back in just a couple of minutes and to do stream outro things. So be right back everyone. Teehee.